The gravel crunched under her boots at 2:47 in the morning, and Kezia Tamboli already knew something was wrong before she even reached her truck. She'd worked the closing shift at Halyard's, a 24-hour diner on the edge of Kenora, Ontario, for 3 years. The same cracked parking lot, the same buzzing fluorescent sign with the letter A, half dead and flickering, the same smell of diesel from the highway and lake water from the north. She knew this lot the way she knew the layout of a C-17 cargo hold, by feel, in the dark, without thinking. So when she heard the laughter, she didn't stop walking. She just started counting. 4 men near the entrance to the lot. 2 more by the dumpsters to her left. That was 6 total. She registered the spacing between them. 3 meters, maybe 4, and filed it the same way she used to file terrain data in theater. Exits. The highway shoulder to the east, the tree line to the west, the diner itself behind her. She kept walking. "Hey, where you going?" She didn't answer. Here's what nobody in that parking lot understood about Kezia Tamboli. She looked like someone's tired aunt coming off a double shift. She was 31, medium height, wearing a fleece-lined jacket with a grease stain on the left cuff that she'd never quite managed to wash out. She had a ponytail held together by a hair elastic she'd borrowed from the Lost and Found 6 months ago and never returned. She carried a canvas tote bag with a cartoon moose on it that her niece had given her for Christmas. She did not look like someone who had spent 7 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, 2 of them attached to Joint Task Force 2 as a close combat instructor. That gap between what people saw and what was actually standing in front of them was something Kezia had thought about a lot since she came home. She thought about it now, crossing the parking lot, listening to the footsteps adjusting behind her. "I'm talking to you." His name, she'd learn later, was Cole Rafferty, 24 years old. He and his crew had been running a low-level intimidation operation along the Trans-Canada Corridor for about 8 months, shaking down closing shift workers, occasionally worse. The OPP had a file on them. The file had not yet produced an arrest. Cole was the kind of young man who had decided, somewhere around age 17, that physical size was a substitute for character. He was broad, loud, and accustomed to people backing down. He stepped in front of Kezia before she reached her truck. "You deaf?" Kezia looked at him. She didn't back up. She didn't lean in. She just stood there, with the canvas tote bag and the grease-stained sleeve, and looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a surgical site, measuring, not afraid. "Move," she said. He laughed. The others laughed with him. One of them, she'd clocked him near the dumpsters, mid-20s, nervous energy, kept shifting his weight, started moving around to her left. This is the part people never understand about real danger. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic music. There's no slow motion. What happens is your body just starts doing arithmetic. 6 variables. 7. The nervous one on the left is the most unpredictable. The big one in front is the most committed. The 2 by the truck are followers. They'll move if the others move, but they won't initiate. Kezia put her tote bag down, carefully, on the ground next to her left foot. "Lady, you're in the wrong part of the night to be playing tough," Cole said. "I'm not playing anything," Kezia said. "Last chance." He reached for her jacket. What happened in the next 45 seconds was later described by a witness. A long-haul trucker named Gary Beaumont, who'd pulled into the lot and was watching from his cab with his mouth open, as the most astonishing thing he'd ever seen in his life. He told the OPP officer the same thing 3 times. She wasn't angry. That's the thing I can't get over. She wasn't angry at all. Gary was right. Kezia wasn't angry. Anger is a luxury. Anger makes you slow, makes you commit to movements before they're necessary, makes you forget about the nervous one on the left. What Kezia felt in that moment was something closer to clarity, a narrowing of the world to its most essential geometry. Cole grabbed her jacket. She turned with the grab instead of against it, using his own pull to redirect her body 90 degrees, and by the time he realized she wasn't where he expected her to be, his wrist was in a position that wrists are not designed to occupy. He went down hard, not because she threw him. She didn't need to, but because his own momentum and the angle of his arm gave him no other option. The ground was his only friend. The nervous one on the left came in fast. She'd expected that. She stepped into it rather than away from it, a counterintuitive move that closes the distance before someone can build force, and used the inside of her forearm to redirect his momentum past her. He stumbled. She didn't. The second man from the dumpsters hesitated for exactly half a second, which was all she needed to put herself between him and the nervous one, making it geometrically impossible for them to reach her simultaneously without getting in each other's way. The two by the truck didn't move. The one she hadn't fully accounted for, fifth man, quieter than the others, had been hanging back near a pickup she'd initially dismissed as unoccupied, came up on her right. She turned to face him, and he stopped hot. Later, he would tell police that he stopped because of her eyes. She looked at me like she was deciding something, he said. Not scared. Just deciding. Cole was on his knees on the asphalt, holding his wrist. The nervous one was on his hands and knees about 2 meters to her left. The third one had backed up against the dumpster and wasn't moving. Gary Beaumont had already called 911 from his truck. Kezia picked up her tote bag. She checked her jacket. The collar had torn slightly where Cole had grabbed it. She noted this with mild irritation. "Stay down," she said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once. They stayed down. She'd been back in Canada for 3 years by then. She'd come home from her last deployment with a shoulder that needed surgery, and a silences that had grown somewhere in her chest and didn't seem to have a bottom. The silence wasn't something she talked about. It wasn't dramatic. It was just there, the way a shadow is there. You don't notice it until the light changes. She'd taken the job at Halyards because her cousin Priscilla had told her they needed someone reliable for the overnight shift, and Kezia had always found it easier to be somewhere useful than to be somewhere comfortable. She liked the 3 a.m. lull, when the last trucker had ordered his second coffee, and the cook was listening to the radio in the kitchen, and the whole world seemed to narrow down to the highway and the lake and the particular quiet of a place that had run out of pretending to be busy. Nobody at Halyards knew what she'd done before. They knew she was strong. She could carry 2 full bus tubs without breaking stride. And they knew she was calm, the kind of calm that doesn't come from a peaceful life, but from something else. The kind of calm that makes other people calm just by proximity. But they didn't know the specifics. The specifics were these. Kezia Tamboli had enlisted at 19, trained as an infantry soldier, been selected for advanced close combat training at 23, and spent the better part of her late 20s teaching other soldiers how to survive situations that most people will never face and don't want to think about. She had a particular gift for what the military calls combatives, the applied science of using your body as an instrument of controlled force. She could break down a confrontation into its components the way a musician hears individual notes inside a chord. She had never wanted to use it in a parking lot in Kenora at 2:47 in the morning. She had not been given a choice. The OPP arrived 11 minutes after Gary Beaumont's call. The officer who interviewed Kezia, a woman in her 40s named Corporal Desmarais, who had the particular tiredness of someone who'd seen too many of these calls go the wrong way, looked at the scene and then looked at Kezia for a long moment. "You want to tell me what happened?" Corporal Desmarais said. "They surrounded me. I defended myself." Desmarais looked at Cole Rafferty, still holding his wrist. Looked at the nervous one. His name turned out to be Ryan Kowalski, who was sitting against the dumpster with his head in his hands. Looked at the 4 who had not been physically engaged and were now very loudly claiming they hadn't done anything, which was technically accurate and also deeply beside the point. "That's 6 of them," Desmarais said. "Yes," Kezia said, "and one of you, yes." Desmarais wrote something in her notepad. Paused. "What did you do before this? Before the diner?" Kezia looked at the highway. A transport truck went past, its lights sweeping across the lot. Military, she said. Close combat instruction. Desmarais nodded slowly. She wrote something else. Then she looked up at Kezia and said, "You need a paramedic?" "No," Kezia said, "but he might." She nodded toward Cole. Cole did. His wrist was fractured in one place and severely sprained in another. He would later maintain, to anyone who would listen, that he'd been jumped by multiple people and that the situation had been completely different from what the witnesses described. Gary Beaumont's dashcam-derived footage made this argument difficult to sustain. Cole Rafferty was charged with criminal harassment and assault. Ryan Kowalski was charged with criminal harassment. The other four were charged as accessories. Cole's attempt to frame the encounter as mutual combat collapsed entirely when Corporal Desmarais reviewed the dashcam footage with the Crown prosecutor, who used the phrase "textbook self-defense" 3 times in the same meeting. None of that was what Kezia thought about afterward. What she thought about was the silence on the drive home. The way the highway looked at 4 a.m., flat and dark and going somewhere she couldn't see. She thought about Ryan Kowalski's face when he'd hesitated. The moment just before he came at her, when she could see him calculating his odds and getting it wrong. And she wondered what had brought him to a parking lot at 3 in the morning with 5 other men, looking for someone weaker to take something from. She didn't have an answer to that. She suspected there wasn't a clean one. What she did have, about a week later, was a phone call. The caller was a woman named Barbara Nkosi, who ran a community center 2 blocks from Halyard's diner. Barbara had heard about the parking lot. Barbara had heard about the parking lot. Barbara had heard about a lot of things, because she'd been running the center for 11 years and had made it her business to know in the surrounding 4 blocks at any given hour of the day or night. She called Kezia on a Tuesday afternoon. "I want to ask you something," Barbara said, "and I want you to hear it before you say no." Kezia was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold. "Okay, we have a women's self-defense program that's been running for 2 years. Our instructor moved to Calgary in September. I've been trying to find someone since September. It is now February." Barbara paused. "I've been told you spent 7 years teaching people how to handle themselves. Where'd you hear that?" "Corporal Desmarais is my sister-in-law's cousin." Kezia looked at her tea. "That's a specific family tree, small town," Barbara said. "Will you come and take a look? No commitment. Just come and see the space and meet the group." Kezia went on a Thursday. The space was a gymnasium with a sprung floor and mismatched mats and a water stain on the ceiling in the shape of something that might have been a dog or might have been a running shoe. There were 14 women in the group, ranging in age from 19 to 67. They were nurses and shift workers, and a retired schoolteacher named Margaret and a woman named Felicia, who'd been commuting 3 hours a week from a town further north because there was nothing like this where she lived. Kezia stood in the doorway and looked at them for a moment. Barbara appeared at her elbow. "So, do they have any existing training?" Felicia did a weekend workshop in 2019. Everyone else has YouTube. Kezia looked at the sprung floor, at the mismatched mats, at the water stain. "I'm going to need better mats," she said. She started the following Thursday. The first session, she didn't teach them anything physical. She sat on the edge of the mat with her legs crossed and talked for 45 minutes about attention, about the difference between fear and awareness, about how the most useful thing a person can develop is not strength or speed, but the habit of noticing what's actually in front of them before it becomes a problem. "The parking lot didn't start in the parking lot," she told them. "It started earlier. It always starts earlier. The question is whether you've been paying attention long enough to know it." Felicia, who drove 3 hours round trip every week, wrote this down in a small notebook she carried. The retired teacher, Margaret, raised her hand. "What if you've noticed, but you can't get away?" "Then we'll get to that," Kezia said. "That's what the rest of this is for." The program ran for 6 weeks, then 12, then became a standing offering on the Thursday night schedule at Barbara and Kosey's Community Center. Word spread the way things spread in small places. A nurse mentioned it to a colleague. A colleague mentioned it to her daughter. The daughter mentioned it to her roommate. By the time autumn came around, there was a waiting list. Kezia kept her shifts at Halyards. She liked the 3 a.m. quiet. She liked the way the cook listened to the radio and the highway looked in the dark. But Thursday nights, she drove 2 blocks to the community center with the water-stained ceiling and the mismatched mats, and she taught 14 women, then 20, then 31, how to pay attention to the world they were already living in. She never talked about the parking lot in class. She didn't think it was the point. The point wasn't what she'd done on a specific night to 6 specific men. The point was what any one of the women in that gymnasium might need to do on any given night, in any given parking lot, in any given version of the same situation. The point was the space between noticing and acting, and how to make it smaller. Felicia, who by the 2nd month had become something like a class leader, asked her once after our session whether she thought about that night. The parking lot. The 6 men. Kezia thought about it. "I think about Ryan Kowalski," she said finally. "The one who hesitated. He's 22, Kezia said. He was charged as an accessory. He didn't touch me. He stopped." She picked up a foam pad from the mat and stacked it against the wall. "I think about what it cost him to stop, and whether anyone ever taught him what it feels like when you make a decision you can actually live with." Felicia didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think someone should have?" Kezia stacked the 2nd pad on top of the 1st. "I think someone should have tried." The case concluded in the spring. Cole Rafferty received an 18-month conditional sentence and was ordered to complete a violence intervention program. Ryan Kowalski received a 12-month conditional discharge. The others received varying degrees of probation. Cole appealed the sentence. The appeal was denied. Kezia learned this from Corporal Desmarais, who called her on a Thursday morning. "Thought you'd want to know," Desmarais said. "Thanks," Kezia said. "You doing okay?" Kezia looked out her kitchen window at the lake. It was May, and the ice had just gone out, and the water was that particular shade of gray-blue that it only gets in the first weeks after breakup, when it's not quite summer yet and not quite anything else. "Yeah," she said, "I'm doing okay." She had a class that evening. 31 women, mismatched mats, water stain on the ceiling. She had a new exercise she'd been developing. Something about reading a room when you first walk into it, cataloging exits and distances before your conscious mind has finished saying hello. She drove to the community center at 6 o'clock. She pulled into the parking lot. She got out of her truck, canvas tote bag over her shoulder, and stood for a moment in the early May evening, listening. A car passed on the highway. Somewhere across the lot, a door opened and closed. Inside the community center, through the gymnasium windows, she could see the lights were already on, and there were shapes moving behind the glass. Her students, arriving early, stretching, talking, waiting. She crossed the lot. She pushed open the door. "Let's talk about what you noticed on the way here," she said, before anyone had time to say hello. "Every single one of you walked across that parking lot tonight. What did you see?" The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a question turns out to be real. Felicia had her notebook open. Margaret was already thinking.